It was a quiet night in the small town of Greenfield, the kind of night where the stars seemed to shine a little brighter, and the air felt a little crisper. The farmer, a man in his late 60s with a weathered face and a heart full of stories, was out checking his fields when he saw it, a streak of light cutting across the sky. It was beautiful, almost magical, but it didn't take long for him to realize this was no ordinary shooting star. The light grew brighter and brighter until it crashed into the forest just beyond his property. The ground shook, and the sound echoed for miles. For a moment, everything was still. Then, curiosity got the better of him. He grabbed his flashlight and headed toward the crash site, his old boots crunching against the dry leaves. What he found there would change his life forever. In the middle of a smoldering crater was a small, metallic pod, glowing faintly. The farmer approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. As he got closer, he heard a soft whimper. It was a child, a boy, no older than 6 or 7, with pale blue skin and eyes that shimmered like starlight. The boy was trembling, his small hands clutching a strange, glowing pendant around his neck. The farmer didn't know what to do. He had never believed in aliens or anything beyond the ordinary, but here was proof, right in front of him. The boy looked up at him, his eyes filled with fear and confusion. Without thinking, the farmer knelt down and held out his hand. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're safe now." The boy hesitated for a moment before taking his hand. His skin was cool to the touch, almost like glass. The farmer helped him out of the pod and wrapped him in his jacket. The boy didn't speak, but the way he clung to the farmer told him everything he needed to know. As they walked back to the farmhouse, the farmer couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The boy was more than just a lost child, he was a mystery, a puzzle that needed to be solved. And deep down, the farmer knew that taking him in would come with risks. But in that moment, all he cared about was keeping him safe. Little did he know, the boy's arrival would set off a chain of events that would test the limits of humanity's kindness and courage. For in the shadows, others were watching, others who would stop at nothing to get the boy back. The farmhouse was quiet, save for the soft crackling of the fireplace. The farmer sat in his old armchair, watching the boy as he slept on the couch, wrapped in a thick blanket. The boy's breathing was steady, but his face still carried traces of fear, even in sleep. The farmer couldn't help but wonder where he had come from, and why he was here. Over the next few days, the farmer did his best to make the boy feel at home. He gave him a spare room, cooked simple meals, and even tried to teach him a few words of English. The boy was quick to learn, picking up phrases and gestures with ease. But there were moments when he would stare off into the distance, his eyes clouded with thoughts the farmer couldn't begin to understand. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the farmer decided to take the boy outside. They sat on the porch, the cool breeze brushing against their faces. The boy looked up at the stars, his eyes wide with wonder. "Do you miss it?" the farmer asked softly, following his gaze. The boy didn't answer, but the way his hand tightened around the glowing pendant told the farmer everything he needed to know. As the days turned into weeks, the bond between them grew stronger. The boy began to open up, showing glimpses of his personality. He was curious, always exploring the farm and asking questions with his limited vocabulary. He loved the animals, especially the old dog that followed him everywhere. And he had a strange fascination with water, often spending hours by the creek, watching it flow. But there were moments that reminded the farmer the boy was no ordinary child. One afternoon, while fixing a broken fence, the farmer accidentally cut his hand. The boy rushed over, his eyes filled with concern. Before the farmer could stop him, the boy placed his small hand over the wound. A soft, blue light emanated from his palm, and when he pulled his hand away, the cut was gone. The farmer stared at his hand, stunned. "How did you do that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The boy simply smiled, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Word of the boy's presence began to spread through the small town. At first, it was just whispers, a strange child living with the old farmer. But soon, people started showing up at the farm, curious to see the boy for themselves. Some brought gifts, while others asked questions the farmer couldn't answer. One day, a sleek black car pulled up to the farmhouse. A man in a sharp suit stepped out, his eyes scanning the property with a calculating gaze. He introduced himself as Agent Harris, a government official. "We've received reports of unusual activity in this area," he said, his tone polite but firm. "We'd like to ask you a few questions." The farmer's heart sank. He knew this day would come, but he had hoped it wouldn't be so soon. He tried to downplay the situation, but Agent Harris was persistent. "We're just here to ensure everyone's safety," the agent said, his eyes narrowing. "If there's anything you're hiding, now's the time to come clean." The farmer hesitated. He didn't trust the government, but he also knew he couldn't keep the boy hidden forever. Before he could respond, the boy appeared at the door, his eyes locked on Agent Harris. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, the boy raised his hand, and the pendant around his neck began to glow. The air seemed to hum with energy, and Agent Harris took a step back, his expression a mix of shock and fear. "What is he?" the agent asked, his voice trembling. The farmer stepped in front of the boy, shielding him with his body. "He's just a child," he said firmly. "And he's under my protection." Agent Harris stared at them for a long moment before finally nodding. "This isn't over," he said, turning to leave. "We'll be watching." As the car drove away, the farmer felt a knot of worry tighten in his chest. He knew the boy's abilities would attract more attention, and not all of it would be friendly. But he also knew he couldn't abandon him. The boy had become like family, and the farmer would do whatever it took to keep him safe. That night, as they sat by the fire, the boy looked up at the farmer with a solemn expression. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice barely audible. The farmer smiled, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "Family looks out for each other." But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that their peaceful days were numbered. The boy's past was catching up to them, and soon, they would have to face it together. The days that followed Agent Harris's visit were tense. The farmer kept a close eye on the horizon, half expecting more government cars to appear at any moment. But for now, the farm remained quiet, and the boy seemed to sense the need for caution. He stayed close to the house, his usual curiosity tempered by an unspoken understanding of the danger they were in. One evening, as the farmer and the boy sat at the kitchen table eating dinner, the radio crackled with a news report. "Authorities are investigating reports of strange lights in the sky over several states," the announcer said. Witnesses described the lights as bright and pulsating, unlike anything they've seen before. Experts are urging the public to remain calm and report any unusual activity. The farmer glanced at the boy, who was staring at the radio with wide eyes. "Is that them?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The boy nodded slowly, his expression grim. The farmer's heart sank. He had hoped they would have more time, but it seemed the boy's past was closing in faster than he had anticipated. He reached across the table and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "We'll figure this out," he said firmly. "Together." The boy gave him a small smile, but the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. The next morning, the farmer decided it was time to take action. He packed a bag with supplies, food, water, a first aid kit, and a few tools, and loaded it into his old pickup truck. The boy watched him from the porch, his arms wrapped tightly around himself. "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Somewhere safe," the farmer replied, trying to sound confident. "We can't stay here anymore." The boy hesitated for a moment before nodding and climbing into the truck. As they drove away from the farm, the farmer couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. This had been his home for decades, a place of peace and solitude. But now, it felt like a trap, a place where they could be found too easily. They drove for hours, sticking to back roads and avoiding towns. The boy was quiet, his eyes fixed on the passing landscape. Every now and then, he would glance at the rearview mirror, as if expecting to see someone following them. As the sun began to set, the farmer pulled into a secluded campsite deep in the woods. It was a place he had visited years ago, a spot so remote that even the locals rarely ventured there. They set up a small tent and built a fire, the crackling flames providing a sense of comfort in the growing darkness. That night, as they sat by the fire, the boy finally opened up. "They're coming for me," he said, his voice barely audible over the sound of the fire. The farmer looked at him, his heart aching at the fear in the boy's eyes. "Who are they?" he asked gently. The boy hesitated, as if unsure how much to say. "They're, like me," he finally said. "But they're not here to help. They want to take me back." "Why?" the farmer asked, his brow furrowing. The boy looked down at the pendant around his neck, his fingers tracing its smooth surface. "I don't remember everything," he admitted. "But I know I'm important to them. And if they find me—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the farmer didn't need him to. The boy's fear was enough to tell him how serious the situation was. "We won't let them take you," the farmer said firmly. "I promise." The boy looked up at him, his eyes filled with gratitude. But there was also something else, something the farmer couldn't quite place. It was as if the boy knew something he wasn't saying, something that filled him with a deep, unshakable sadness. The next morning, they woke to the sound of distant thunder. The sky was dark, heavy with clouds, and the air felt charged with electricity. The farmer packed up their camp quickly, sensing that they needed to keep moving. As they drove through the winding forest roads, the boy suddenly sat up straight, his eyes wide with alarm. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice filled with urgency. The farmer slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt. Before he could ask what was wrong, the boy pointed to the sky. A bright light streaked across the clouds, followed by a deafening boom that shook the ground. The farmer's heart raced as he realized what was happening. They were here. The boy's hands trembled as he clutched the pendant, his eyes filled with fear. "We have to hide," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The farmer nodded, his mind racing. He knew they couldn't outrun whatever was coming, but he also knew they couldn't just sit there and wait to be found. "Come on," he said, grabbing the boy's hand. "We'll find somewhere safe." They ran into the woods, the sound of the crashing light still ringing in their ears. The boy's abilities seemed to guide them, his glowing pendant lighting the way through the dense trees. But even with his help, the farmer couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. As they reached a small cave hidden among the rocks, the boy suddenly stopped, his eyes widening in horror. "They're here," he whispered, his voice filled with dread. The farmer turned to look, his heart pounding in his chest. Emerging from the trees were figures, tall, shadowy, and unlike anything he had ever seen. Their eyes glowed with an eerie light, and their movements were unnaturally smooth. The boy stepped forward, his pendant glowing brighter than ever. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. The farmer wanted to argue, to protect the boy as he had promised. But he knew this was beyond him. This was the boy's fight, and all he could do was stand by his side. As the figures approached, the boy raised his hand, and the air around them seemed to hum with energy. The farmer held his breath, his heart racing as he prepared for whatever came next. The figures moved closer, their glowing eyes piercing through the dim light of the forest. The boy stood firm, his small frame radiating an unexpected strength. The pendant around his neck pulsed with a bright, blue light, casting eerie shadows on the trees around them. The farmer stood behind him, his heart pounding, unsure of what to do but ready to protect the boy at all costs. One of the figures stepped forward, its voice a low, guttural growl. "You cannot hide from us," it said, the words echoing unnaturally in the air. "You belong with us." The boy shook his head, his voice trembling but defiant. "I'm not going back," he said. "Not with you." The figure tilted its head, as if amused by the boy's resistance. "You have no choice," it said. "You are the key. Without you, our kind will perish." The farmer's mind raced. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he knew one thing: he couldn't let them take the boy. He stepped forward, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "He's not going anywhere," the farmer said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. The figure's glowing eyes shifted to the farmer, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, without warning, it lunged forward, its movements impossibly fast. The boy reacted instantly, raising his hand and sending a burst of light toward the figure. The energy struck it mid-air, sending it crashing to the ground. The other figures hesitated, their glowing eyes flickering with uncertainty. "Run!" the boy shouted, grabbing the farmer's hand and pulling him deeper into the woods. They ran as fast as they could, the boy's pendant lighting the way. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees twisting and turning as if trying to slow them down. Behind them, the figures gave chase, their movements silent but relentless. The farmer's legs burned with exertion, but he pushed himself to keep up with the boy. He could hear the figures gaining ground, their presence like a dark shadow closing in. "We can't outrun them," the farmer gasped, his breath coming in ragged bursts. The boy glanced back, his eyes filled with determination. "We don't have to," he said. "We just have to outsmart them." He led the farmer to a narrow ravine, its steep sides covered in thick vines. Without hesitation, the boy began to climb down, his small hands gripping the vines with surprising strength. The farmer followed, his heart pounding as he struggled to keep his footing. At the bottom of the ravine was a hidden stream, its waters dark and swift. The boy waded into the water, pulling the farmer along with him. "The water will mask our scent," the boy explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "They won't be able to track us." The farmer nodded, too exhausted to question the boy's plan. They moved downstream, the cold water numbing their legs but providing a strange sense of relief. Above them, the figures reached the edge of the ravine, their glowing eyes scanning the darkness below. For a moment, it seemed like they had lost them. But then, one of the figures pointed toward the stream, and the chase began again. The boy's face fell, his earlier confidence wavering. "They're too strong," he whispered, his voice filled with despair. The farmer gripped his hand tightly. "We'll find another way," he said. "We just have to keep moving." They climbed out of the stream and continued through the woods, the figures close behind. The boy's pendant began to flicker, its light growing dimmer with each passing moment. "I can't keep this up much longer," the boy admitted, his voice strained. The farmer's mind raced. They needed a plan, something to buy them time. As they reached a clearing, he spotted an old, abandoned cabin hidden among the trees. "In there," he said, pulling the boy toward the cabin. They slipped inside, the door creaking shut behind them. The cabin was dark and musty, its walls lined with cobwebs. The farmer barricaded the door with a heavy wooden table, his hands trembling as he worked. The boy slumped against the wall, his breathing shallow. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely audible. "This is all my fault." The farmer knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "None of this is your fault," he said firmly. "You didn't ask for any of this. And I'm not going to let them take you." The boy looked up at him, his eyes filled with tears. "But what if we can't stop them?" he asked. The farmer hesitated, his heart aching at the fear in the boy's voice. "We'll find a way," he said. "Together." Outside, the figures reached the cabin, their glowing eyes piercing through the cracks in the walls. The farmer and the boy held their breath, their hearts pounding as they waited for what would come next. The door shook as the figures began to pound against it, the wood splintering under the force. The farmer grabbed a rusty shovel from the corner of the room, his hands gripping it tightly. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. The boy nodded, his pendant flickering weakly. As the door finally gave way, the farmer stepped forward, ready to face whatever came next. But before the figures could enter, a bright light filled the cabin, blinding everyone inside. The farmer shielded his eyes, his heart racing as he tried to make sense of what was happening. When the light faded, the figures were gone, and standing in their place was a woman, tall, with silver hair and eyes that glowed like the boy's. "It's okay," she said, her voice calm and soothing. "I'm here to help." The boy stared at her, his eyes wide with recognition. "You," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. The woman knelt beside him, her hand gently touching his cheek. "You've been brave," she said. "But you don't have to face this alone anymore." The farmer looked between them, his mind reeling. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling. The woman turned to him, her glowing eyes filled with gratitude. "I'm his mother," she said. "And I've come to take him home." The cabin fell silent, the tension in the air palpable. The farmer stared at the woman, his mind struggling to process her words. The boy, his boy, had a mother? And she was here, standing in front of them, her presence both calming and unnerving. The boy stepped forward, his eyes wide with a mix of hope and fear. "You're really here?" he asked, his voice trembling. The woman nodded, her expression softening. "Yes," she said. "I've been searching for you for a long time." The farmer tightened his grip on the shovel, his instincts telling him to be cautious. "How do we know we can trust you?" he asked, his voice firm. The woman turned to him, her glowing eyes filled with understanding. "You've protected him," she said. "For that, I am eternally grateful. But now, it's time for him to come home." The boy looked between the farmer and the woman, his small hands clutching the pendant around his neck. "I don't remember much," he admitted. "But I know I'm supposed to go back. I don't want to leave him." The farmer's heart ached at the boy's words. He had grown so attached to him in such a short time, and the thought of saying goodbye was almost too much to bear. But he also knew he couldn't stand in the way of the boy's destiny. "What happens if he goes with you?" the farmer asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman's expression grew solemn. "Our world is dying," she said. "We sent him here to find a way to save it. But the ones who followed him, they don't believe in his mission. They want to use him for their own purposes." The boy's eyes filled with tears. "I don't want to hurt anyone," he said. "I just want to help." The woman knelt beside him, her hand gently resting on his shoulder. "I know," she said. "And that's why you must come with me. Together, we can find a way to save both our world and yours." The farmer felt a lump form in his throat. He had always known the boy was special, but he had never imagined the weight of the responsibility he carried. "What about the ones chasing him?" the farmer asked. "They're not going to stop, are they?" The woman shook her head. "No," she said. "But if we can reach the portal in time, we can close it behind us. They won't be able to follow." The boy turned to the farmer, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "Will you come with us?" he asked. The farmer hesitated. He had spent his entire life on Earth, rooted in the familiar rhythms of the farm. The thought of leaving everything behind was overwhelming. But as he looked into the boy's eyes, he knew he couldn't let him face this alone. "I'll come," the farmer said, his voice steady. "But we need to move quickly." The woman nodded, her expression filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said. "We don't have much time." They left the cabin, the woman leading the way through the dense forest. The boy walked between her and the farmer, his small hand gripping the farmer's tightly. The pendant around his neck glowed faintly, casting a soft light on the path ahead. As they walked, the woman explained more about their world. It was a place of advanced technology and ancient wisdom, a civilization that had thrived for millennia. But now, it was on the brink of collapse, its resources depleted and its people divided. "We sent him here because Earth is unique," she said. "Your world has something ours lacks, a connection to life, to nature. We believed he could find a way to restore that balance." The farmer listened in silence, his mind reeling from the enormity of it all. He had always thought of himself as a simple man, someone who lived a quiet life far removed from the complexities of the world. But now, he was being thrust into a role he could never have imagined. As they reached the edge of the forest, the woman stopped, her eyes scanning the horizon. "The portal is close," she said. "But so are they." The farmer followed her gaze and saw the figures emerging from the trees, their glowing eyes fixed on them. They moved with a relentless determination, their presence like a dark shadow closing in. "We need to run," the woman said, her voice urgent. They took off, the boy's small legs struggling to keep up. The farmer scooped him into his arms, his heart pounding as he ran. The woman stayed close, her glowing eyes scanning the path ahead. As they reached a clearing, the woman pointed to a strange, shimmering light in the distance. "There," she said. "The portal." But before they could reach it, the figures closed in, surrounding them on all sides. The boy's pendant flickered weakly, its light barely holding back the darkness. The woman stepped forward, her voice filled with authority. "You will not take him," she said. "He is our hope." One of the figures stepped forward, its voice a low growl. "He is our salvation," it said. "And we will not let you take him from us." The boy clung to the farmer, his small body trembling with fear. "What do we do?" he whispered. The farmer looked at the woman, his mind racing. "Is there another way?" he asked. The woman hesitated, her glowing eyes filled with uncertainty. "There is one option," she said. "But it's dangerous." "What is it?" the farmer asked. "We can open the portal here," she said. "But it will take all of our energy. We may not survive." The boy's eyes filled with tears. "No," he said. "I don't want anyone else to get hurt." The farmer knelt beside him, his hand gently resting on his shoulder. "Sometimes, we have to make sacrifices for the ones we love," he said. "And I love you like you're my own." The boy nodded, his small hand gripping the farmer's tightly. "Okay," he whispered. The woman stepped forward, her glowing eyes filled with determination. "Hold on to each other," she said. "And don't let go." As the figures closed in, the woman raised her hands, and the air around them began to hum with energy. The boy's pendant glowed brighter than ever, its light merging with the woman's. The farmer held the boy tightly, his heart pounding as the world around them began to blur. And then, with a blinding flash of light, everything changed. The world around them dissolved into a whirlwind of light and sound. The farmer held the boy tightly, his arms wrapped around him as if he could shield him from the chaos. The woman stood at the center of it all, her glowing eyes fixed on the portal she had opened. Her hands trembled with the effort, and the farmer could see the strain on her face. "Hold on," she shouted over the roaring wind. "We're almost there." The boy buried his face in the farmer's chest, his small body shaking with fear. The farmer could feel the pendant around the boy's neck pulsing with energy, its light blending with the swirling colors of the portal. But just as they were about to step through, the figures lunged forward, their glowing eyes filled with desperation. One of them grabbed the boy's arm, its grip like iron. "You cannot leave," it growled, its voice echoing unnaturally. The boy cried out in pain, and the farmer reacted instinctively. He swung the shovel he still held, striking the figure with all his strength. The impact sent it stumbling back, but more were closing in. The woman turned, her glowing eyes blazing with fury. "Let him go," she shouted, raising her hands. A burst of energy shot from her fingertips, knocking the figures back. But the effort seemed to take its toll. She staggered, her strength fading. The portal flickered, its light growing dimmer. "We're losing it," she cried, her voice strained. "We have to go now." The farmer didn't hesitate. He scooped the boy into his arms and ran toward the portal, the woman close behind. The figures recovered quickly, their movements swift and relentless. As they reached the edge of the portal, the woman turned to face the figures one last time. "Go," she shouted to the farmer. "I'll hold them off." The farmer's heart ached at the thought of leaving her behind, but he knew they had no choice. He stepped through the portal, the boy clinging to him tightly. The last thing he saw before the portal closed was the woman standing tall, her glowing eyes filled with determination as the figures closed in around her. Then, everything went dark. When the farmer opened his eyes, he found himself in a place unlike anything he had ever seen. The sky was a deep shade of purple, dotted with stars that shimmered like diamonds. The ground beneath his feet was soft, almost like moss, and the air was filled with a strange, sweet scent. The boy stirred in his arms, his small hands clutching the farmer's shirt. "Where are we?" he asked, his voice trembling. The farmer looked around, his mind struggling to process their surroundings. "I think, we're in your world," he said softly. The boy's eyes widened as he took in the sight. "It's beautiful," he whispered. But the farmer's heart was heavy. He couldn't stop thinking about the woman, the boy's mother, and the sacrifice she had made to get them here. "We need to find help," the farmer said, his voice firm. "Your mother said we could save both our worlds, but we can't do it alone." The boy nodded, his expression filled with determination. "I think I know where to go," he said. He led the farmer through the strange, alien landscape, his pendant glowing faintly to light the way. The air was filled with strange sounds, soft hums and distant echoes, but there was no sign of life. As they walked, the boy began to remember more about his world. He pointed to a towering structure in the distance, its surface shimmering like crystal. "That's the citadel," he said. "It's where the elders live. They'll know what to do." The farmer nodded, his legs aching from the journey but his resolve unwavering. "Let's keep moving," he said. But as they approached the citadel, they were met with a sight that filled them with dread. The once majestic structure was in ruins, its crystal walls cracked and crumbling. The ground around it was scorched, as if it had been ravaged by fire. The boy's face fell, his small hands trembling. "What happened here?" he whispered. The farmer placed a hand on his shoulder, his heart aching at the fear in the boy's eyes. "We'll figure it out," he said. "But we need to be careful." They entered the citadel cautiously, the air inside thick with dust and silence. The walls were lined with strange symbols, their meanings lost to time. The boy's pendant glowed brighter as they walked, its light revealing more of the devastation. As they reached the heart of the citadel, they found a large chamber filled with strange, glowing orbs. In the center of the room was a pedestal, its surface covered in intricate carvings. The boy approached the pedestal, his small hands tracing the carvings. "This is it," he said. "This is where we can restore the balance." But before he could do anything, a voice echoed through the chamber. "You're too late." The farmer turned, his heart pounding as he saw the figures from before emerging from the shadows. Their glowing eyes were filled with anger, and their movements were slow and deliberate. One of them stepped forward, its voice a low growl. "The elders are gone," it said. "And soon, this world will be too." The boy shook his head, his eyes filled with tears. "No," he said. "We can still fix this. We have to." The figure laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "You're just a child," it said. "What can you do?" The farmer stepped forward, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "He's not alone," he said. "And we're not giving up." The figure's glowing eyes narrowed, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, without warning, it lunged forward, its movements impossibly fast. The boy reacted instantly, raising his hand and sending a burst of light toward the figure. The energy struck it mid-air, sending it crashing to the ground. The other figures hesitated, their glowing eyes flickering with uncertainty. "We have to activate the pedestal," the boy said, his voice filled with urgency. "It's the only way." The farmer nodded, his mind racing. "What do you need me to do?" The boy placed his hand on the pedestal, his pendant glowing brighter than ever. "Just stay close," he said. "And don't let go." As the figures closed in, the farmer gripped the boy's shoulder tightly, his heart pounding as the chamber filled with light. The chamber was bathed in a blinding light as the boy's pendant pulsed with energy. The figures hesitated, their glowing eyes narrowing as they shielded themselves from the intensity. The farmer held onto the boy tightly, his heart racing as he felt the power surging through the small frame of the child he had come to love like his own. "What's happening?" the farmer asked, his voice barely audible over the hum of energy. The boy's eyes were closed, his face a mask of concentration. "I'm trying to activate the citadel," he said, his voice strained. "But it's taking all my energy." The farmer's heart ached at the sight. The boy was just a child, yet he carried the weight of two worlds on his shoulders. "Is there anything I can do to help?" he asked, his voice filled with desperation. The boy opened his eyes briefly, his gaze meeting the farmer's. "Just, don't let go," he whispered. The farmer nodded, his grip tightening. "I won't," he said firmly. "I'm right here with you." The figures began to recover, their glowing eyes fixed on the boy. They moved forward, their movements slow but determined. The farmer knew they were running out of time. One of the figures stepped forward, its voice a low growl. "You cannot save this world," it said. "It is already lost." The boy shook his head, his small hands trembling as they rested on the pedestal. "No," he said, his voice filled with defiance. "I won't give up." The figure lunged forward, its hand reaching for the boy. The farmer reacted instinctively, stepping in front of the boy and raising the shovel he still carried. The impact sent the figure stumbling back, but more were closing in. The boy's pendant flickered, its light growing dimmer. "I can't hold it much longer," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The farmer's mind raced. They needed a miracle, something to turn the tide. And then, he remembered the woman, the boy's mother, and the sacrifice she had made to get them here. "Your mother believed in you," the farmer said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "And so do I. You're stronger than you think." The boy looked up at him, his eyes filled with tears. "But what if I'm not strong enough?" he asked. The farmer knelt beside him, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder. "You don't have to do this alone," he said. "We're in this together." The boy nodded, his small hands gripping the pedestal tightly. He closed his eyes, his pendant glowing brighter than ever. The chamber filled with a deafening hum, the light so intense it was almost unbearable. And then, with a final burst of energy, the citadel came to life. The walls shimmered with light, the strange symbols glowing with power. The figures stumbled back, their glowing eyes filled with shock. The air was filled with a strange, melodic sound, like a song that had been silent for too long. The boy slumped against the pedestal, his small body trembling with exhaustion. "It's done," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The farmer caught him before he could fall, his heart aching at the sight. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with pride. "You saved your world." But the boy's eyes were filled with sadness. "Not yet," he said. "There's still more to do." The figures began to retreat, their glowing eyes flickering with uncertainty. One of them turned to the boy, its voice a low growl. "This changes nothing," it said. "Our world is still dying." The boy shook his head, his small hands clutching the pendant. "No," he said. "There's still hope. And if we work together, we can save both our worlds." The figure hesitated, its glowing eyes filled with doubt. But then, slowly, it nodded. "Perhaps you are right," it said. "Perhaps there is still a chance." The farmer watched in awe as the figures began to change, their glowing eyes softening as they approached the boy. One by one, they knelt before him, their movements filled with reverence. "We will follow you," one of them said, its voice filled with newfound respect. "You are the key." The boy nodded, his small face filled with determination. "Then let's get to work," he said. The farmer helped the boy to his feet, his heart swelling with pride. He had always known the boy was special, but now, he saw the true extent of his strength and courage. As they left the chamber, the citadel began to heal, its crystal walls shimmering with light. The air was filled with a sense of hope, a feeling that had been absent for far too long. The boy led the way, his pendant glowing faintly to light the path. The farmer stayed close, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder. "You've done something incredible," the farmer said, his voice filled with awe. The boy looked up at him, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. The farmer smiled, his heart aching with love for the child who had become like a son to him. "We're family," he said. "And family looks out for each other." As they walked through the healing citadel, the boy's small hand found the farmer's. Together, they faced the challenges ahead, their bond stronger than ever. The citadel, once a crumbling ruin, now pulsed with life. Its crystal walls shimmered with a soft, golden light, and the air was filled with the hum of energy. The boy, though exhausted, walked with a sense of purpose, his small hand gripping the farmer's tightly. Behind them, the figures, once their pursuers, now followed with a newfound respect, their glowing eyes no longer filled with malice but with hope. "Where do we go now?" the farmer asked, his voice low but steady. The boy pointed to a towering structure at the heart of the citadel, its peak disappearing into the purple sky. "The spire," he said. "That's where we can restore the balance. But, it won't be easy." The farmer nodded, his grip on the boy's hand tightening. "We've come this far," he said. "We're not turning back now." As they approached the spire, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. The air grew heavier, and the light from the boy's pendant flickered uncertainly. The figures behind them hesitated, their glowing eyes scanning the horizon. "Something's wrong," one of them said, its voice a low growl. "The spire, it's resisting." The boy's face fell, his small hands trembling. "It's because of the damage," he said. "The spire was designed to protect our world, but it's been corrupted. If we don't fix it, everything we've done will be for nothing." The farmer knelt beside him, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder. "Then we'll fix it," he said firmly. "Together." The boy nodded, his eyes filled with determination. "We need to reach the top," he said. "But the spire will try to stop us." As if on cue, the ground shook violently, and the spire's surface began to crack. Strange, shadowy creatures emerged from the fissures, their glowing eyes filled with malice. They moved with unnatural speed, their forms shifting and twisting as they advanced. The figures stepped forward, their glowing eyes blazing with determination. "We'll hold them off," one of them said. "You must reach the top." The farmer hesitated, his heart pounding. "But..." "Go," the figure interrupted, its voice filled with urgency. "This is our fight now." The boy grabbed the farmer's hand, pulling him toward the spire. "We have to trust them," he said. "They're trying to make up for what they've done." The farmer nodded, his resolve hardening. Together, they ran toward the spire, the shadowy creatures closing in around them. The boy's pendant glowed brighter, its light pushing back the darkness. As they reached the base of the spire, the ground shook again, and a massive crack split the surface. The farmer grabbed the boy, shielding him as debris rained down around them. "We need to climb," the boy said, his voice filled with urgency. The farmer looked up at the towering structure, his heart sinking. The spire was impossibly tall, its surface smooth and unyielding. "How?" he asked, his voice trembling. The boy placed his hand on the spire's surface, his pendant glowing brighter than ever. "It will respond to me," he said. "But I need your help." The farmer nodded, his grip on the boy's hand tightening. "I'm with you," he said. The boy closed his eyes, his small hands glowing with energy. The spire's surface began to change, forming handholds and footholds where there had been none before. "Let's go," the boy said, his voice filled with determination. They began to climb, the spire's surface trembling beneath their hands. The shadowy creatures swarmed below, their glowing eyes fixed on them. The figures fought valiantly, their energy clashing with the darkness, but it was clear they were outnumbered. As they climbed higher, the air grew thinner, and the light from the boy's pendant began to flicker. The farmer could feel the strain on the boy's small body, but he didn't complain. He simply kept climbing, his eyes fixed on the top. "We're almost there," the farmer said, his voice filled with encouragement. The boy nodded, his breathing shallow. "I can feel it," he said. "The heart of the spire, it's calling to me." As they reached the top, the spire's surface opened, revealing a large, circular platform. In the center was a glowing orb, its light pulsating with energy. "That's it," the boy said, his voice filled with awe. "The core of the spire." But before they could approach it, the ground shook violently, and a massive shadowy figure emerged from the darkness. Its glowing eyes were filled with rage, and its voice echoed unnaturally. "You cannot restore what has been lost," it said, its voice a low growl. "This world is beyond saving." The boy stepped forward, his small hands glowing with energy. "You're wrong," he said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "There's always hope." The shadowy figure lunged forward, its movements impossibly fast. The farmer reacted instinctively, stepping in front of the boy and raising the shovel he still carried. The impact sent him stumbling back, but he held his ground. "You're not taking him," the farmer said, his voice filled with defiance. The boy placed his hand on the farmer's shoulder, his pendant glowing brighter than ever. "Together," he said. The farmer nodded, his heart swelling with pride. Together, they faced the shadowy figure, their bond stronger than ever. The boy raised his hands, his energy merging with the light from the core. The shadowy figure hesitated, its glowing eyes flickering with uncertainty. "This world is worth saving," the boy said, his voice filled with conviction. "And I'll do whatever it takes to protect it." With a final burst of energy, the boy activated the core, its light filling the spire and pushing back the darkness. The shadowy figure let out a deafening roar before dissolving into nothingness. The spire began to heal, its surface shimmering with light. The air was filled with a sense of peace, a feeling that had been absent for far too long. The boy slumped against the farmer, his small body trembling with exhaustion. "We did it," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The farmer held him tightly, his heart aching with love for the child who had become like a son to him. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with pride. As the light from the core spread across the land, the figures below looked up, their glowing eyes filled with awe. The boy's sacrifice had not only saved their world but had also given them a second chance. The light from the spire's core spread across the land like a wave, healing the cracks in the earth and restoring the vibrant colors of the alien world. The once dark sky now shimmered with stars, and the air was filled with a sense of peace that had been absent for far too long. The boy, though weak and trembling, stood tall beside the farmer, his small hand gripping the farmer's tightly. "It's over," the boy whispered, his voice filled with awe. "We did it." The farmer knelt beside him, his heart swelling with pride. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "You saved your world." The boy looked up at him, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. The farmer smiled, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder. "We're family," he said. "And family looks out for each other." As they stood on the spire's platform, the figures from below began to climb up, their glowing eyes filled with awe and respect. One of them stepped forward, its voice a low, reverent growl. "You have given us a second chance," it said. "We will not waste it." The boy nodded, his small face filled with determination. "This world is worth saving," he said. "And together, we can make it better." The figures knelt before him, their movements filled with reverence. "We will follow you," one of them said. "You are the key." The farmer watched in silence, his heart aching with love for the boy who had become like a son to him. He had always known the boy was special, but now, he saw the true extent of his strength and courage. As the light from the core continued to spread, the boy's pendant began to flicker, its glow growing dimmer. The farmer noticed and knelt beside him, his voice filled with concern. "Are you okay?" he asked. The boy nodded, but his small body trembled with exhaustion. "I'm just tired," he said. "Using the core, it took a lot out of me." The farmer's heart ached at the sight. He scooped the boy into his arms, holding him tightly. "You've done enough," he said. "It's time to rest." The boy leaned against him, his small hands clutching the farmer's shirt. "I don't want to leave you," he whispered. The farmer's eyes filled with tears. "You're not leaving me," he said. "We're in this together, remember?" The boy nodded, his eyes closing as he drifted into a deep sleep. The farmer held him tightly, his heart filled with a mixture of pride and sadness. He knew the boy's journey was far from over, but for now, he could rest. As the days passed, the alien world began to heal. The figures worked tirelessly to rebuild what had been lost, their glowing eyes filled with hope. The boy, though still weak, began to recover, his strength slowly returning. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the farmer and the boy sat on the edge of the spire's platform, looking out over the land. The boy's pendant glowed faintly, its light blending with the stars above. "It's beautiful," the boy said, his voice filled with wonder. The farmer nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "It is," he said. "And it's all thanks to you." The boy looked up at him, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. The farmer smiled, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder. "We're family," he said. "And family looks out for each other." The boy nodded, his small hand gripping the farmer's tightly. "I don't want to go back," he said. "I want to stay here, with you." The farmer's heart ached at the words. He had grown so attached to the boy in such a short time, and the thought of saying goodbye was almost too much to bear. But he also knew the boy had a greater purpose, a destiny that went beyond the farm or even this alien world. "You have a responsibility," the farmer said gently. "Your world needs you. And so does mine." The boy's eyes filled with tears. "But what about you?" he asked. The farmer smiled, his voice filled with love. "I'll always be with you," he said. "No matter where you go." The boy nodded, his small hands clutching the pendant around his neck. "I'll never forget you," he said. The farmer's eyes filled with tears as he pulled the boy into a tight embrace. "I'll never forget you either," he said. As the light from the core began to fade, the boy's pendant glowed brighter than ever. The farmer knew it was time. He helped the boy to his feet, his heart aching with love and pride. "It's time to go," the farmer said, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. The boy nodded, his small hand gripping the farmer's tightly. "Thank you," he said. "For everything." The farmer knelt beside him, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder. "You've taught me so much," he said. "About love, about courage, about what it means to be family." The boy smiled, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You're my family," he said. The farmer's heart swelled with love as he pulled the boy into one final embrace. "And you're mine," he said. As the light from the pendant grew brighter, the boy's form began to fade. The farmer held on as long as he could, his heart aching with love and pride. And then, with a final burst of light, the boy was gone. The farmer stood alone on the spire's platform, his heart heavy but filled with hope. He knew the boy's sacrifice had not only saved this world but had also given him a second chance. As he looked out over the land, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. The boy's legacy would live on, not just in this world but in his heart. And as the stars shimmered above, the farmer knew he would never be alone. Life lesson. The story teaches us that family is not defined by blood but by love and sacrifice. It shows us that even in the darkest times, there is always hope, and that the bonds we form with others can give us the strength to overcome any challenge.